You're here tonight to hear about Isle Royale. Tonight we have Henry Davies here. I first met Henry at the Great Lakes Sea Kayak Symposium some years back in the Upper Peninsula of Michigan. Henry's a sea kayak guide in the Pictured Rocks National Lakeshore. He's an ACA coastal kayak instructor. He's been teaching sea kayaking in Michigan, Wisconsin, and Minnesota for more than 15 years. He's been on multi-day trips to Pukaskwa, Isle Royale, Pictured Rocks, Grand Island, Sleeping Bear Dunes, the Beaver Island Archipelago, Lake Superior Provincial Park, and the Grand Traverse between the Upper Peninsula of Michigan and Door County, Wisconsin. Like me, his passion is using a Greenland paddle, one of those funny skinny sticks, and he loves to visit remote places in the Great Lakes. So now I'm going to turn it over to Henry. Welcome.
So I'm going to talk about something maybe a little different from the normal perspective of people who've been to Isle Royale. A lot of people, when you go there, they're hikers. I don't tend to hike so much anymore. I used to go backpacking. Now I do a lot more of seeing places by kayaks. So I see the island from the perimeter of it more and see things that are not necessarily visible from the trails, or they're a little off trail or whatever. So just a little bit about Isle Royale. Isle Royale is a national park. It's in Michigan, although it seems like it should be more part of Minnesota or maybe Ontario. It's about 15 miles from the Minnesota shoreline. It's the largest island in Lake Superior, and it's kind of the eye of the wolf. If you look at Lake Superior as a wolf's head. It was established as a national park in 1940, and most of it's designated wilderness. There are just a few areas that aren't wilderness. It's approximately 45 miles long, not 9 miles wide, and it includes about 400 islands. I've been out there backpacking once and 6 trips kayaking, 3 of which were circumnavigations. Most recently, we went around the island in August of this year, and we actually paddled over there from Minnesota. So it was about a 15-mile crossing to get from Minnesota to the island. And here, it's kind of the first time we saw the island when we paddled over from Minnesota, just the beginnings of it. And why would I want to go, or anybody want to go to Isle Royale? There's a lot of things to see. There's a lot of history. There's a lot of natural environment with dense boreal forest, some historic fishing camps, shipwrecks, and some lighthouses. You can also go there to find food, and then some other berries that maybe aren't as edible. Maybe they are, I don't know. But this is a plant that's primarily found in the Pacific Northwest, but then there's a few areas where it's found on Isle Royale and Passage Island. There's also some Ents on the island if you happen to notice them. And so how do you get to the park? Most people are going to get out there with a ferry or maybe a private boat or a seaplane. I've gone out there. Usually I'll go out there on the Isle Royale Queen, but this last time, like I said, we paddled out there, so we kayaked out there, and that's not something I'd recommend for most people. The group I was with, we've done those kind of trips. That's 2-week-long trips and with long crossings. This is the 5th trip we've done together. And as we were going out there, you never know what Lake Superior is going to do. We got about a mile or so, maybe 2 or 3 miles from the island, and a storm came over to us. So then the winds picked up to pretty strong, and the waves picked up to about 4 feet. And so we just, as we got to the island, we found a place to gather out of the wind and decide what we wanted to do, because we weren't sure that our original plan of where we wanted to camp made sense anymore. So in addition, there are other considerations for, if you're visiting the shore of the island instead of the inland, and you want to do that by paddling, then you have to assess your abilities. If you're not normally a coastal paddler who are not usually doing 10-mile crossings, whatever, then you probably want to stick to inland lakes and protected harbors and coves and use the portage routes and probably avoid Lake Superior shoreline in a lot of cases. But, you know, pick your day. If it's a nice calm day, you can paddle along Lake Superior, but know that it might change. So this is Macago Cove. Some of you may have camped there. There's a nice big campground at the inlet, the bottom end of Macago Cove. It's about 2 miles in from Lake Superior. Some days it's really calm. When we were there this time, we had maybe 1.5 foot waves and pretty strong winds when we paddled in there to visit. This is Blake Point. It's pretty notorious for being a dangerous spot on Lake Superior, on Isle Royale, because it sticks out into the lake and you can get wind and waves from every direction. Also, on this side of it, this north side of it, there's about 1.5 miles of tall cliffs where there's no place to land. And on the other side, there's only a 0.5 mile. So you've got a couple miles of no good place to land. It's not easy to land on these rocks here either. I've been out there on other trips. This was in 2008, and a storm popped up. We listened on our weather radio, on our VHF radio, and they said, there's a storm over Isle Royale with 50-mile-an-hour winds. All ships take refuge. So yeah, we landed on the island and waited it out. We didn't really have much notice because it snuck over the island. We didn't even see it coming. So when you're paddling there, you're going to have to plan for things like fog and wind and waves. Because it's out in the middle of the lake, it's got a long fetch, which is the distance that the wind can act on the lake unimpeded by other islands and landforms. And those cliffs will create reflecting waves. So in a lot of places, you know, you saw some of the rocks, they're hard to land when it's calm conditions. They're impossible when it's rough. So it's not really the best beginner environment. You want to learn other places and then come here. So you don't want to get in over your head. Susan's close to over her head. But when we were paddling this day, there were actually waves going up to like 3 to 6 feet. And what you're seeing here is about 1.5 feet because her head's still above water, maybe 2 feet. So at 3 feet, she would disappear and we maybe would see the tip of her paddle. And this is the Palisades, which is that 1.5 mile section of sheer cliffs north of, well, going west from, on the north side from Blake Point. They're beautiful, but there's really no place to land, but it's a really cool place to paddle too. And even this beach, which in the picture, it flattens it out. It looks pretty benign. It's pretty steep there. Every step you're taking, you're kind of creating an avalanche of all those rocks. So it takes a bit to get a boat loaded with all the gear up the hill. And things happen. You have to be ready to repair your boat. I had a couple leaks in my kayak on one of the trips, and I put Gorilla Tape on it. That held it for the rest of the trip. And I actually didn't fix my kayak for about 1.5 years. It lived with that Gorilla Tape for a couple trips. So we were out there this year, and we were at a campsite near Blake Point, and we were just getting ready for dinner, and somebody was coming up, and they were calling, hello, hello, hello. And so we walked out to the dock, see what was going on. And there was somebody who was paddling this kayak, which is really not a suitable kayak for Lake Superior for open waters. And he had just gone around Blake Point, and he was paddling with his 2 friends that were in a canoe. He was behind the canoe, but then he got to our campsite first, and he didn't know where the canoe was. So we wound up calling a Mayday call to get help for his friends who were lost, basically. So part of the problem they ran into is, if you look here, you see this fog. That fog is smoke. So there was a fire on Isle Royale this summer, and they were going to take one of the portage trails from Duncan Bay into Tobin Harbor, but the fire was right near that portage trail. So they decided it was safer to paddle around the tip of the island, around Blake Point, instead of hiking next to a fire. And that got them into trouble because the canoe got capsized along Blake Point, and the kayak passed them, didn't even see them. He didn't know they were capsized there. After we had made the Mayday call, a fisherman found them there, but it was a little bit too rough. They couldn't land their fishing boat. They couldn't help them. They just knew they were there. They were out of the water. They were safe. So those two canoeists wound up sleeping on the rocks of Blake Point, covered in a wet tarp overnight. So I'm betting they weren't very comfortable. And in the morning, the volunteers from Amygdaloid Island, which is one of the satellite islands on the north shore of Isle Royale, brought them a paddle because they lost one of their paddles. And then they escorted them to Rock Harbor or Snug Harbor, where they were going to meet their ferry the next day. So they got there, everything was fine, but it was kind of wondering what was, the guy standing here by the kayak, he was really wondering what was going on with his brother and his friend, because he didn't know where they were for half an hour or so the night before. And we hiked out to Blake Point. We actually found their paddle, so we gave it back to them before they took off on their ferry the next day. One of the other things that Isle Royale is kind of famous for is the wolves and moose, the predator-prey study that's been going on since '58. A couple of years ago, we were down to like two wolves on the island. Now there's something like 15, but there's still a lot of moose, and the moose they're like winning the battle of moose against vegetation though. So makes it hard for some of the trees to grow from small to big again. But there's an area, there's the Bangson cabin, which is on Rock Harbor, which is where Candy and Rolf Peterson spend their summers, and they raise their kids there. And they host the wolf study, the moose and wolf study there every summer. And there is where they've collected a lot of different parts of moose skeletons, usually the skulls. And then they check them, just try and figure out why did they die and how old were they and what do they know about those moose? What can they figure out from the skeletons? And we've been out there, we've found moose skeletons just along the shore too. And then one day we saw 5 moose right in one area, just paddling. We were paddling, they were walking, but it's nice to see them alive too. And Isle Royale has some interesting geology as well. It's mostly rock with a thin top of soil. It's famous for its copper deposits. It's less famous for its conglomerate rock and the Portage Lake lava deposits. So this is some of that conglomerate, which is basically like concrete. It's sandstone with rocks embedded in it. This sea arch we saw in 2008, but I haven't seen it since in my other 2 circumnavigations. So I think it collapsed since that time. It was on the west end of the island. And here we have some of the lava deposits or sandstone and conglomerate, and how it's stacked up on top of each other. The lava deposits were from about 1.1 billion years ago, when there was the mid-continental rift, which allowed lava to flow out. It didn't create a cone like a volcano, but the lava flowed out in a flat surface, and it repeatedly did this over and over, creating many different layers of lava. And then later in time, the center of it dished down, so it made like a trough. And one side of the trough is Isle Royale, the other side of the trough is the Keweenaw Peninsula. And so when the erosion happens on those top edges of those layers, it creates the ridges and valleys that Isle Royale is famous for, because they make it dangerous for ships, because you can be in really deep water and then 10 feet later it's a foot deep. Here's some sandstone. Obviously it was on the bottom of some sort of a lake or a sea, and it formed these waves. And this is right on the south shore of Isle Royale. And then there's some other rocks that are just interesting, smooth. They don't seem to match much else that's on the island. and they're in amongst this lava here, basalt. And then there's some other formations. So this is columnal basalt. So it's like hexagonal columns of basalt. And that we saw that on several places on the island, usually on the satellite islands. So this was on Edwards Island. And then just the vertical rock of the Palisades. So I talked about the ridge and valley. So this ridge down the middle here, this is Amygdaloid Island, that island that's on the north shore of Isle Royale. It's separated from the main island by this half-mile wide channel, the Amygdaloid Channel. And it's got this ridge running down it. And then there's a valley over here. There's Amygdaloid Lake in the valley. There's another ridge, and then there's Lake Superior. Or there's this ridge. There's the valley, which is the Amygdaloid Channel, and then the ridges of the main island. But at one point in time, this ridge the water level was much higher. This sea arch was formed by an ancestral lake of Lake Superior, probably by Lake Nipissing, when the water level was about 40 to 60 feet higher. The sea arch is maybe about 50 feet higher than the current Lake Superior level. And so it beat through the rock on that arch when it was at water level. Another interesting thing, here's one of these ridges. It's got a gap in it. So this is Belle Isle over here, and this part is the main part of Isle Royale. And through the gap is called the keyhole. And depending on what the weather is, you can have a current going into the screen or out of the screen. So we were here on one trip and we paddled down current, forward the way we're going now. And then a couple days later, we came back and the current was coming in through that gap. And this island in the distance here is actually Amygdaloid Island again. And this is from that ridge on top of Amygdaloid Island. And here's the keyhole right there. And here's another sea arch. This one is on the south side of Caribou Island, but this is more recent. This is almost at Lake Superior level. It's maybe 20 feet above the lake. The waves could probably easily get there in any decent sized storm. So talking about decent sized storms, it's probably 100 yards from the lake up to the vegetation here. That's how big the waves get and how much they keep vegetation from growing. This is on Passage Island, which is about 4 miles off the tip off Blake Point. So it's pretty exposed out there in the middle of the lake, exposed to some big storms. And this is Raspberry Island, which is right near Rock Harbor, where the ferries from Michigan come into Isle Royale. Here it's much closer, but still the waves are so regular along here, they keep vegetation from growing up anywhere close to the water level. And along the north shore, this is kind of towards the west end of the island, the lava gets beat up by the waves in such a way that you can see through holes of it or paddle through it if you can find an opening. So this shows in a smaller scale, the idea of that valley and ridge structure. You can see how the rock is sloped here. And that's kind of the edge of a layer that's been eroded away. And down here, there was a softer layer that eroded and made more of a valley. And then we're up here again. This is on Menagerie Island, which is a boundary of the Siskiwit Bay, between Siskiwit Bay and and Lake Superior. So what was some of the human history of the island? There was copper mining. That happened anywhere from almost 6,000 years ago to about 100 years ago. And there's logging, which they used to do a logging in the winter and pile up the wood and then transfer it off the island in the spring to wherever they were taking it. And there was a pretty good sized forest fire that occurred in 1936. And there's still evidence from that forest fire. Forgot to point it out, but you could see some of the different tree growth from the ridge of Amygdaloid Island. And commercial fishing was a big thing along here as well. So we had the mining dangerous activity. So there were a lot of, or not, maybe not a lot, but there were miners who were killed in the process, and their remains are buried on Cemetery Island. So it's got some of these old, this is actually a slab of wood for a headstone. And there's several of those. It's kind of different. And after the mining failed, they were not getting what they needed to for their business, whatever. There were resorts on Isle Royale, and people had their summer cabins there, and some smaller fish camps that were like family-run businesses were there. And so this was one of the resorts. This is the Isle Royale Lodge. It was a resort when the island was formed in 1940, and then the property was taken over by the Park Service. And this is one of the buildings that still exists from that period in time. So there are also lighthouses on the island. There's 4 of them. On Passage Island, which, like I said before, is 4 miles out from the tip of Blake Point, there's a lighthouse on Passage. It's a bit of a ways up above the water level, but it's guarding that passage between Passage Island and Blake Point, which is a shipping route. And it used this tram to get supplies and so on up to the lighthouse from the ship, up this tramway. This dock is not a good place to, it's an okay place to dock a boat, but it's not a good place to store a boat. The island has a natural harbor in the middle of it, but it's about a 3/4 of a mile walk from the harbor to the lighthouse. And there's no good way to haul gear and supplies on that path. When we went out to Passage Island, it was nice and calm. It's like you never think Lake Superior is going to be. And then when we came back, whatever it was, 2 hours later or something, it was a little less calm. But this is looking at Isle Royale from basically at Passage Island. You can see the different ridges, the different valleys. Right in here is Duncan Bay, which is where that fire was. So you can see some of the color differences is because of the smoke that was going on right then. The fire, when we were in our camp, we could actually smell the smoke because we were camped maybe a mile from the fire. Isle Royale Lighthouse, Rock Harbor Lighthouse, is the oldest lighthouse on the island. This is at the west end of, almost end of Rock Harbor. It's kind of right across from Daisy Farm. And this is also a museum. I don't know that they lock it. I've always just been able to walk in there. It's got a lot of exhibits about mainly shipwrecks, but some about how people lived there and some about what they recovered from some of the shipwrecks. In the past, I've also been able to go up the tower and look from up there, although I think this year the stairs are sometimes looking like they need help. I think they were being repaired this year. This island is near the lighthouse. In the lighthouse, they actually have a picture of this tree. And this picture I took in 2005, but the picture they have is from 1896, and it looks just like that. So kind of makes you wonder how old some of the trees on the island really are. This is the Menagerie Island Lighthouse, or sometimes called the Isle Royale Lighthouse. And this is on one of the boundary islands between Siskiwit Bay and Lake Superior. And that's the one of the outhouses. That one, for some reason, is falling over. There's no good place that I can understand to park a boat at Menagerie Island. They did anchor chains into the rock and do something like that, but it doesn't seem like there's a real good place. You saw my picture before where the kayaks were. That's the same spot. It's really shallow and there's not a lot of room to maneuver. This one is Rock of Ages Lighthouse. You can see this from Superior Shoreline if you look really, or not Superior, Minnesota Shoreline if you look really close. It's really hard to pick out sometimes. But it's guarding this ridge here. If I go back a slide, this ridge here, and over in this side, there's actually 3 shipwrecks. We didn't see any of them this time. I've never seen them. And then there's historic fish camps. There's still some I would like to see. I didn't see the ones in the Washington Harbor area. We needed to leave the island when the weather allowed us to and not stick around too much longer. This is an old fish camp on Amygdaloid Island, but is currently used as the park by the Park Service as a satellite ranger station. And a lot of these are hard to get good pictures of because they're in a pretty dense forest. So, but this one is Crystal Cove, which is on the east end of Amygdaloid Island. And here's what the fishing boats that were left there around. It seems like, and I don't know this, but that the property went to the Park Service not too much before 2005, because in 2005 they were rebuilding the dock and doing some things. But so I think that the life leaseholder was still around until close to then. And this is what those boats now look like this year. And this totem pole, this was a picture from 2005, I think, and it's still there. These barrels of fishing nets and floats and stuff were here in 2005, and I hadn't seen them since until recently. And now there are a lot of fishing nets and floats are inside one of the buildings behind glass, behind a window. So you can still see them, but hopefully they won't disappear. And this is Captain Kidd Island. And there's a series of buildings here, quite a few. This is the first time I've ever seen this boathouse actually open and not have a boat in it. I've been out here 4 or 5 times. And here's one of the cabins there. It's boarded up for the winter. This was in mid-August. And this is Johnson Island. It's in Robinson Bay. And the Park Service has an agreement with, when people, the Park Service bought the property from people, they could either sell their property or they could get a life lease. And a bunch of people got life leases, but at this point in time, all of the life lease people have died, and some of their descendants have special use permits, so they can still visit what used to be their family property as long as they keep it up and do some volunteerism on the island. So you can see they're rebuilding some of the stairs and keeping the buildings up, because if somebody wasn't there, they'd just be collapsing. And this is an old fishing boat on Johnson Island. Some of the fish camps, the only evidence I've seen is the old cribs of the docks. So the dock has been destroyed by the lake, and I couldn't find any evidence of building on the island, just this crib. But so I know there was something there, but I don't know what it is. And here you can maybe pick it out. There's a crib here too, below the set of stairs. On this one, there's some buildings up on top. This is Clay Island, but I've only seen them from the water. They don't look very happy, but there's no good way to get to them because the stairs are definitely not very happy. A bunch of years ago, this one was kind of treated as a live-in museum. This is the Edison fishery. It's right near the Rock Harbor Lighthouse and in between the Rock Harbor Lighthouse and the Bankson cabin. And so, but now I don't believe they've been doing it as a live-in fishing museum for a while, but I don't know that for sure. And that was one of the original boats, fishing boats, that's at the Edison fishery. And then down by Chippewa Harbor, this is, as I understand it, is a reconstruction of the cabin that was what Holger and Lucy Johnson lived in when they did their fishing in that area. So there were a lot of different families and fisheries on the islands over time. This is the fish camp on Wright Island, and it's seen better days. The dock looks pretty good. There's some interesting things you can find if you walk around in the woods around near the fish camps. We found somebody had found a shoe and put it inside that Lucy and Holger Johnson cabin. And I found another shoe that looked like it probably matched it back in the woods. And the old fishing boat, you could see some of the, like the propeller shaft is here. You could see some of that stuff in there, but I'm sure the plants don't belong in the boat. And this is Fisherman's Home. It's probably one of the last places where there was a life lease holder. When we were there in 2008, Mark Rude was there and he was the life lease holder. and he has since died, but some of their buildings in this property were from the late 1800s. Several of them, I guess, that's what he said. And these are the docks at Fisherman's Home and the net drying racks. And then just around the corner from that is a place called Little Boat Harbor. That's where that steep beach was, rock beach, where we would create avalanches by walking up and down it. We found pieces of an old stove there. We didn't know that there was an old fish camp there at the time. It's like after we found stuff, then you get home, you do research, and it's like, now I need to go back. We found an old wooden net float just up on the high part of the beach. And then in addition to fishermen, there were people who just had summer cabins out there. And a lot of those are under that special use permit kind of thing right now. Some of them, not so much. So like I'd heard about this many years ago, about this fireplace on Merritt Island, and I finally got out there and found it this year. So when the Park Service took over a lot of the properties, if they bought the property, they weren't concerned about it as being historic or anything. So a lot of the cabins and buildings got torn down, destroyed. Some of them, as I understand it, were taken out onto the ice and burned in the winter. So that's what happened. Something like that happened to this building. So all that's left is a chimney. And here's one of the cabins. A lot of these are in Tobin Harbor, but some of them are on the shore of Rock Harbor near where the ferries come in. And when we were there in 2005, we talked to somebody who was a life or a special use permit person staying at this cabin. And it's right next to this. So it's interesting that these things are still out there. It's sort of interesting that they're so close to the water too. And there's some more of that columnar basalt. And we were looking at some of that first set of columnar basalt, and we heard somebody yelling at us, and they came down from up above and they came down to the beach and started talking to us. It was part of the family who has the special use permit for that particular island. So they owned the island before the park was established. And they stay there in the summer, and it was their last day there. They were busy getting all their stuff onto their boat to take it over to Rock Harbor so that they could get it onto the Ranger, the big Park Service boat, so it could go home with them before the end of the season. And this is their outdoor kitchen. But one of the things this family has done is when other families have lost their property to the park, or the family just wasn't interested in it or didn't exist anymore, they would collect some of the boats, the small boats that were part of the history of the island as well. In particular, this white and clear coat rowboat, I saw it. So this picture is from this year when we were on the island. This picture is from 2005 when we saw somebody actually paddling that boat, rowing that boat on Tobin Harbor. So, and then I provided this picture back to that family. They could tell me exactly who that was, which was kind of interesting. And this is their cabin on that island with its fireplace. And I think this is the one that had the boats in it. And right near there, this is a building that was apparently built by the women of that family just before the Park Service came into being. They call this Gem Cabin. It's on Gem Island. It's a small island. It's pretty, if you didn't know the cabin was there, you're not going to see it. And it's kind of hard to get into it anyway. There's not a good place to land. And Isle Royale is kind of famous for being a difficult place for boats. There are a lot of shipwrecks. There are big ships. There are a lot of little boats too. This is probably a fishing boat that's in the back of Crystal Cove. So that first fish camp I talked about. This is a picture from 2005, but I've looked for that boat again since then several times. The lake level's gone up and down since 2005. I have not seen evidence of this boat, so I don't know if the plants have grown over it and I just can't see it, or what's exactly happened. that's another reason I kind of think that, you know, I wonder how long before we were at Crystal Cove the first time they had stopped using it. This is the America, which was a big boat for the area because it would carry passengers up and along Isle Royale and to and from Isle Royale from Minnesota and Ontario, and as well as go down to Duluth. It would haul fish, salted fish for the different fisheries, get that out to their buyers, that kind of thing. This boat crashed into one of those very shallow areas next to a deep area in the North Gap near Washington Harbor, so on the west end of the island, and it sank fairly quickly. This happened in 1924, I think it was. So these are pictures taken from a kayak of this boat. The boat's at a really steep angle, so all I can see is the bow of it. I can just see it disappearing down into the lake. As well, there are several wrecks we tried to find, supposedly should be viewable from kayak depth. One of them's in Five Fingers Bay, a tugboat, which was first seen in like the 70s, and it was seen by an airplane flying over the island. So you'd think we'd be able to see it, but it was pretty wavy that day. Another one is just an old fishing boat that was scuttled when they closed down their fish camp because they sold it to the Park Service. And this boat is supposedly in between Star Island and Davison Island. And as well on Passage Island, there are two of them in that natural harbor. There's a Coast Guard boat which had an engine explosion. So they pushed it out away from the dock and it wound up sinking in the harbor. And then there's a pleasure cruiser, which there's not really any information. It just sort of sounds like we found this boat there. We don't know whose it is. We don't know why it's there, but maybe I just didn't find the right information to read about it. This is another fishing boat that I'd heard about, so I was looking for that this time. This is the Awanisha, and it was Holger Johnson's fishing boat, and he was scuttling it in Chippewa Harbor, but apparently it didn't sink fast enough, and the wind pushed it onto shore, so it's been there ever since. And I'm sure it looked better at one point. It would have been nice to see it when it looked more like a boat, but it's still kind of cool. So that's about it.
Anyone have any questions?
It looks like there's a couple of questions in the chat.
Oh,
Let's see. Do we need to make an appointment to visit the Moose and Wolf Study Center, or can we go there anytime? Is it on Rock Harbor?
it is on Rock Harbor. I don't know how you would make an appointment because it's not like they have phone service or anything. You can visit it anytime. You're just not going to find Rolf and Candy Peterson there at any time. Sometimes they'll be off doing something. Sometimes they'll be there. So, and I've been there once when they were there and once when they weren't.
Okay. Is there evidence of Native American life?
I'm sure there is. Some of the copper mines are actually started where the Native Americans had been mining copper. I don't know. I wouldn't know the evidence of Native American life if I saw it. So I haven't really noticed it.
I was wondering if you had any maps of these, all these islands. Are they all very close to Isle Royale, or the ones you've been talking about? Or
yeah, Passage Island is the farthest. Well, and Menagerie is about 3 miles out. Let's see if I can. Can I get out of here? There we go. Here it is. I'm going to try and go to the slide 3. There we go. So Passage Island is right up here off the tip. Menagerie Island is right down here. And so this is about 4 miles away from the main island. This one's about 3 miles away from the main island. Everything else is pretty close in. So Amygdala Amygdaloid Island is right here. A lot of them are chains of islands, and Tobin Harbor is in here. So that's an example of those ridges and valleys. This ridge here is made up of islands, and the valley is Rock Harbor. And this is Siswit Bay, which I was talking about. And
What kind of map is this? Is this from the?
I forget exactly where I got it. It's basically a topo map, but I'm looking at it really blown up, way out, far out.
Okay. Yeah.
So it's a bunch of topo maps stitched together by a program.
Oh, wow. Really cool. Huh. I think I dropped it to your friend, so go ahead.
What was
I
that?
was going to say another question was, did you use charts or Nat Geo plastic maps or what?
Some of each. I usually have the Nat Geo map for Isle Royale, and almost always have charts for something like this, especially when we have a big crossing.
Yeah.
But the charts in Isle Royale don't help as much with figuring out where is it too shallow, because kayaks can go in 4 inches,
Yeah.
Hey, Henry, this is Rob.
All to look at the Minong mine, the copper mine up by McCargo Cove.
What was the question?
I wondered if you hiked in to look at that the Minong mines.
Yes, I've hiked in there a few times, like 3 times. And that part of what I was doing was not talking about the things on the trails. So talk about things that most people don't see. But yeah, I've been there. We went there this year.
I'm assuming when you're paddling, you've got some kind of weather radio. So can you talk a little bit about what you bring with you and who you have it tuned to?
We've got several things. So yeah, each one of us has a VHF radio, which allows us to tune into weather stations and to call for help, like the Coast Guard. And so we'll know ahead of time what radio station we want for weather. My weather radio, if I turn it to scan, I can listen to, my partners that I'm paddling with. Usually we're paddling so close, we don't actually talk to each other on the radio. I can listen to 16 in case, which is the emergency channel, and how we would get to the Coast Guard, or how people would hail each other in case there's something going on we might hear about. And I'll listen to the weather station for a long crossing, because there's been times when I'll get a weather alert on my weather radio, and it tells me something like, there's a thunderstorm in this region and with 70-mile-an-hour winds. And I quick go through the math and, okay, it's 70 miles away and it's moving at 40 miles an hour. I've got almost 2 hours to get the heck out of here, kind of thing. Or where I live, where I work, it's moving 40 miles an hour and it's 40 miles away, and we have an hour to get off the lake, which then becomes, yeah, can we do that? Because I've got a group of amateurs, people who have been in kayaks on Lake Superior before. And we also, everyone in my group has an inReach, which allows us to do a satellite communication out to get help if we need to, or just to tell people what's going on.
Thank you.
What was the date range? What dates were you out there this year?
The 13th through the 25th. We were planning on going out on the 12th, but the wind and waves were not something we wanted to paddle 15 miles in.
Okay.
Early on, you mentioned that there's a 3 or 4 mile section that has steep cliffs and nowhere to pull in. Can you point that out on your map?
Yeah, so the Palisades are right here on that north side of that point. And then just around, and Blake Point's right here. And then even on the south side, it's about a half mile or so before you can get to someplace that might be reasonable to land. Once you get to Merritt Island, you'll start getting protection from some of the other islands. But also from over here at Hugginen Cove to Little Todd Harbor, there's about 12 miles of with 12 miles with cliffs and very little opportunity for landing, depending on the weather. So that's actually maybe more of a concern. But this has some areas where there's low gravel beaches that are not probably big enough that you'd want to camp on. But this has vertical cliffs going deep into the water, so it gets a lot of reflecting waves. So they are a little bit different.
Thank you.
Let's see, I'm not sure I know the answer to this, but somebody's asking about how it was that Michigan got Isle Royale.
Yeah, I'm not sure either. I know why the US has it, but I don't know why Michigan has it.
Okay. And then somebody else wanted to know about permits for kayaking.
There's nothing special to permit for kayaking. It's basically no different than backpacking, with one exception maybe. So there's about a 30-mile stretch from here, just inside Sisquot Bay, around to Grace Island, where there are no official campsites. So you're pretty much going to want to have a cross-country camping permit for that section, unless you want to paddle 30 miles in a day. But you wouldn't want to depend on paddling 30 miles in a day. But other than that, you're pretty much camping at the same kind of campsites. There are some campsites like up here, Merritt Lane doesn't have trail access, so it's usually used by fishermen. Duncan Narrows and Duncan Bay are used by fishermen, things like that. But you're using, other than that, some of the same campsites that the hikers are using and the fishermen are using.
Okay, are there other questions?
Yes, one more. In terms of planning a paddle, what resources are there that we can go to?
For paddling along and around Isle Royale?
Yeah, yes.
We've got Dufresne. He's got a section on paddling there. He's not going to talk too much about paddling around the island. It's more using some of the portage paths. Where's my other book? Right off, I can't find it. There's a book of paddling Lake Superior and Lake Michigan. Don Diamond is the author, I believe. And they've got a section on Isle Royale in that book. So I think the Jim Dufresne book is going to be your best piece of information, and that and other people who've done it.
Thanks.
Are there any other questions?
I had one more question. Where that last boat that you had the picture of toward the end of the slideshow, where did you say that was? The wooden boat that was partially in the water?
That was in Chippewa Harbor.
Okay.
So it's one I had read about, so I wanted to find it this time around.
So there's another question. What is the story of how the US acquired the island?
Apparently, I can't remember if it was who exactly it was, but the idea was it was the normal portage route, or the normal route that the fur trade used. And apparently because of that, then they said it was the Pigeon River. And so then you're going that way around Isle Royale because the canoes of the fur trade would follow the shore. They weren't going to go out to Isle Royale and around it.
Any other questions? Maybe we'll wrap up the questions. It seems like we're I'm just looking through the chat and see what other questions there were. Well, one question is, what month were you there at Isle Royale? But it seems like you've been there a lot of different times. So what's the best time to go there?
I'm not sure what the best time to go then is. I've been out there in August a number of times because it works out with other things that I wind up doing in the summers. It doesn't compete with some of the kayak symposiums I teach at, things like that. So that's been the driving factor for going in August. And generally, there's not too many bugs in August either, fortunately.
I think I probably know the answer to this question, but there's a question. Did you use the shelters for overnights or your own tents?
Some of each, because some nights we were not in campsites that had shelters, or some nights we were camped where there wasn't even a campsite because we were using cross-country permitting. But yeah, if there was a shelter and it was available, we used it.
And another question, did you have a problem with biting flies?
I have had problems with them. This trip, I don't remember them in particular, but might be one of those things that you forget the bad parts and remember the good parts.
All right, last call for questions. Any last questions? No, people are really quiet. Well, thanks very much for the presentation, Henry. It was really interesting.
Oh, thanks.
Interesting island, interesting history. So thanks very much.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yes, thanks, Henry.